Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Nicole Dupuis, and I'm the Director for Technology and Innovation at the American Public Transportation Association, otherwise known as APTA. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Route 50's event today, entitled Routing Optimization, Transportation Transformed. As we all know, the state and local government transportation sectors were heavily upended by the COVID-19 pandemic, from increasing rates of curbside delivery that necessitated street redesign to adjusting traffic rates and plummeting public transit usage. State and local governments have been examining ways to retool their transportation approaches for the last 18 months. Today, we have the distinct pleasure of digging a little deeper on that. We're going to explore some of the policy and technology behind some transportation changes that are here to stay and some that are likely due to change. Joining me for this discussion, we have Roger Milar, who's the Secretary of the Washington State Department of Transportation, and Garrett Eucalito, who's the Deputy Commissioner for the Connecticut Department of Transportation. I'd like to start by giving each of you 1 or 2 minutes to introduce yourselves to our audience and tell us about your work. And if it's okay with you, Secretary Milar, we'll start with you.
Great. Well, thank you. It's great to be here today. My name is Roger Milar. I'm the Secretary of the Washington State Department of Transportation. I was appointed Secretary by Governor Inslee in August of 2016 and confirmed by the Senate about 6 months later. It's been the best job I've ever had. I have 7,000 coworkers at WashDOT around the state of Washington, and our budget is about $4 billion a year. We are a multimodal transportation agency, including the Washington State Ferry System. This is the 70th anniversary year for Washington State Ferries, the largest ferry system in North America, the second largest in the world. We're responsible for highways and bridges, obviously, for public transportation, for intercity passenger rail, for the ferry system, and a number of other things. We are not a highway department. We're a multimodal transportation agency.
Great, thank you, Secretary Milar. And Deputy Commissioner Eucalito, let's go to you. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Sure, thanks. Appreciate being here. My name is Garrett Eucalito. I'm the Deputy Commissioner at the Connecticut Department of Transportation. So we are a multimodal transportation agency as well. We have responsibility for all of the state's roads and bridges, 3,400 employees here at ConnDOT. We also are responsible for the passenger rail system in Connecticut, Metro North line, the Shoreline East, the Hartford line, as well as our branch lines, as well as our bus public transportation system. The vast majority of those trips are under our CT Transit umbrella, which is overseen by ConnDOT. And we do have 2 river ferries, the oldest continuously operating ferry in the country. So in good company with Secretary Milar.
Awesome. Well, we can kind of segue now into our conversation. And I'd like to start by asking you a heavy question about kind of how the pandemic has really upended your state's transportation sector. I know that within APTA, it's been a universal experience, one that we could probably classify for the transit industry as probably like 100-year experience. And it's a big mountain to climb. So Roger, we will start with you. Can you just talk to the audience a little bit about what your experience has been at the helm of the DOT out there?
Well, yeah, COVID has been an experience. It was a tragedy and a crisis inside of the, I think, bigger crisis of climate change. For us, it was a bit of a surprise. We were one of the first states hit, and we were hit hard and early. The governor sent everybody home to stay home and stay healthy, and we did. We focused initially on essential services, getting food to market, getting essential workers to work, getting people to medical care. And we also focused on keeping our employees safe. We are asset managers, and when we respond to crisis, it's usually a fire, a flood, a snowstorm, whatever. And this time the asset at risk was our people. So everyone who could telecommute started telecommuting, and we're still doing that 16 months later. We kept the Washington State ferries running. We kept the highway system running. And then we started focusing on the financial impact of it, the human resources impact of it, and how and when we come out of the pandemic. And we're not bouncing back to anything. We're bouncing forward into the future. So in April and May of last year, everybody was at home. Today, in the end of June of 2021, overall on our highway system, traffic is down about 8% from pre-pandemic levels. On our toll facilities, it's down about 33% because when there's not a lot of congestion out there, people are not using the toll facility options to being stuck in congestion. Our ferry ridership is down 35% from pre-pandemic levels. Statewide, looking at all the transit agencies on average, we're down about 60%, and we're down still about 67% on our intercity passenger rail service. So those are our concerns to us. It's affected the revenue that comes to Washington State. 88% of my budget is raised in the state of Washington. Federal funding is 12% of our budget. So when we're not collecting gas tax and ferry fares, we're hurting. The Congress came to the rescue in a series of acts, finally with the last one that was passed in January, February, and made us somewhat whole for the short term. So we are at a point where I think the governor is going to be celebrating coming out of the pandemic towards the end of this week. The 4th of July weekend is a great time for a celebration. And we are looking at what our posture will be coming out of the pandemic in terms of how we work and in terms of how the pandemic has changed the transportation space, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in more detail.
Definitely. And thank you for sharing your experience with us. And Garrett, do you want to tell us a little bit about kind of how things went for you in Connecticut?
Sure. So we had many of the similar experiences as Secretary Milar. When we looked at what happened when we got hit, our governor did send state employees home. Those who could work from home were working from home, but around half of our workforce here at Connecticut DOT had to still go out and continue to work on our roadways the entire time. We did see traffic plummet on our roadways. We had continuous count stations recording everything on our roadways so we could track that. And we noticed the drop, and we actually used some of that to our advantage at the DOT, where we expedited some construction work. We used the lower traffic during the daytime, during rush hours. There was no more rush hours, so we were able to do work during the daylight hours instead of working at night, making it safer for our construction crews out there. We saw a precipitous drop, though, in our public transportation space on our commuter rail system, Metro North, which was prior to COVID the busiest commuter rail system in the country. We had a greater than 95% drop in ridership. We continued to run service. We reduced service a little bit, as well as on our other rail lines, just because of the cost of trying to continue to operate them without fare box recovery. On the bus side, on public transportation, we never really dipped below 50% drop in ridership of our CT transit system, maybe 55 or 60% drop at the lowest point in ridership. But we bounced back. Right now, we're down only about 30% in ridership on our bus transportation fleet. And what we did during, we got agreement with the other transit providers in the state. We shut down front door boarding. We suspended fare box enforcement. And we continued that from April through October until we had plexiglass barriers installed on every single bus in the state to protect our drivers. So, once we had that installed, we were able to move forward. But bus proved to be that critical lifeline for people to get to the hospitals for work, get to the supermarkets to get food, go to the pharmacy to get their prescriptions. It proved to be so essential that this legislative session that just concluded, our legislature actually increased funding for public transportation, not just for base services, but to expand services in our state. And we were able to use this show of the essential nature to make that case.
It's fantastic. And you mentioned, Garrett, you mentioned traffic patterns. Did the state of Connecticut adjust traffic rates or patterns, and if so, for whom? And how did you go about doing that?
So great question. So we constantly monitored the traffic volumes on our interstates and limited access highways, as well as all the speeds that were out there through our speed count information. And we were able to, it was as close to real time as we could get. It was always a day or two late from the data points. But the governor's office and our office used that throughout the first several months of the pandemic to track what was happening on the ground, what was happening to economic activity. As we began to see lower infection rates, what was happening to businesses. So we used that data to help inform how we were responding with our construction work, with our maintenance work. And so the governor's office could make informed decisions about when to begin to lift restrictions and those types of decisions. At the local level, the governor did issue many executive orders that gave local governments a lot more authority to allow for commercial activity in the streets that previously was not allowed, or that would require lengthy planning and zoning approval processes. The governor's executive orders allowed that, to allow parklets or dining in the streets, closing down streets without having to get approval. We at the DOT, we worked to with Federal Highway Administration to waive fair market value for any commercial entity that wanted to use our right-of-way, so that businesses could use our state-owned right-of-way at the DOT along roadways to put outdoor dining and not have to pay a rental fee for that. So those all helped to try and lessen the impact of COVID at the local level.
Great. And Roger, did you do any adjustment to traffic rates or patterns in Washington?
Well, like Garrett, we were monitoring. We set up a COVID-19 multimodal transportation system performance dashboard that we updated each morning at 10:30. We were tracking ADT on our highway system and working with all of the transit agencies that we interact with. We were keeping track of their ridership, ferry ridership, performance on our toll system, and we were tracking active transportation, aviation, you name it. So everybody was getting a daily update on that. Health departments, the state health department and county health departments were using the information to help judge the effectiveness of the various decisions that were being made about people staying home, not traveling, and the like. And we're using that same dashboard as we come out. We're at about 8% below our ADT, our average annual daily traffic, but the pattern is changing in terms of when people drive during the day. Prior to the pandemic, only about 16% of the ADT, the daily traffic, was commuters. 85% of it was everything else. And what we're seeing coming out of the pandemic is the morning commute really hasn't come back. The afternoon has, and the midday is up from where it was. And that, I think, reflects the extent to which people are teleworking. And teleworking at the depth of the crisis was, you were huddled, you were sheltering in place. Teleworking today is a lifestyle option, which gives people a lot of flexibility, and traffic is changing in response to that. Transit is changing in response to that. And what we don't have right now is enough data to identify a trend. But I've always been a believer in using data, but data doesn't make decisions. Models don't make decisions, people make decisions. And so what I've been advocating for in my role is a values-based, data-informed approach coming out of this. So we're going to have to make some decisions about how we invest that are going to be based on our values as a state, as a community, and inform those decisions with the data that we're seeing. So, what does it do to how we crew our boats on the Washington State Ferry System, which is the third largest transit agency in Washington? How do we support transit providers in rural Washington who went from getting people to services to taking services to people? They were delivering food, they were delivering medicine, they were doing very different things. And coming out of the pandemic, those are things maybe we want to continue doing. As Garrett indicated, in Connecticut, we had a safe, healthy, and active streets initiative working with our Department of Health and our Department of Commerce. And we identified about 350 miles of state highway that are also main streets. And we made space on those streets available to local businesses and to communities who wanted to put active transportation space out that hadn't existed before. Got a little, the people that, the highway is for the highway as opposed to it being a means to an end. We're a little concerned about that, but we could have people driving back and forth through an empty an empty retail community, or we could have businesses open. Some of our restaurants, 90% of their business at a very tough time was outdoor dining, and we were providing the space. So we've been measuring and we've been shifting our response as we learn more.
Thank you. And that's such a great segue into my next question. At APTA, as we have worked with the transit industry and transit agencies in, working through the global pandemic, I will say that I am really, really proud of the role that so many of our transit agency members took on in serving their communities in other ways, but also in the prominent role of transit as kind of the backbone of the mobility system. And I don't think we're the only ones that think that as APTA. Really, the frontline workers, operators of those at those transit agencies were the frontline workers getting the frontline workers to work in a really, really tenuous and challenging time. So, for us, it has really reinforced just how important transit is in the broader mobility ecosystem. A question for both of you about public transit and ridership. We've kind of already touched a little bit about on this, but when public transit usage plummeted, how did your state adjust? And Roger, you took this on a little bit in your last response, but I'll start with you. And my follow-up question for that is, are there any adjustments that you will keep going forward into the new normal, and or will you revert back to kind of previous patterns or operational modes?
We're, from a transit perspective, we're really still in it because ridership is down and remains down. Now it's different depending on the fare box situation of the various agencies. Washington State Ferries, we run our operation, it's 80% fare box recovery. So when fare box is down, we're hammered, but the smaller agencies where fare box is really a token part of the overall budget, operating budget of the agency, it's not as big of an issue. And what we're looking at, it depends on the situation. Special needs transit, small rural transits, the small cities transit, all the way up to King County Metro, our largest operator. We're learning as we go, and what we're looking at is, those essential workers, the men and women who have to go to work, who don't have the the opportunity to telework because they need to be there. And that includes, the transit operators. It includes the men and women who staff the Washington State ferry fleet. It includes the men and women who maintain our highway system. They have to get to work, and they use the bus system to do that. The teleworking crew, everybody who could stay home, stayed home. And from a public health perspective, that was great. From a economic perspective for the agencies, it was kind of tough. But we need to really parse out the role of telework going forward. We're huge, huge advocates of telework at the Washington State DOT, but it affects the travel patterns on our highway system. It affects the transit agencies as well. So we've been working, we have a transportation demand management executive board here in Washington State that includes a lot of transit agency participation. We got together the transit agencies working with the Washington State Transit Association to see how people were handling the pandemic and how it was transforming transportation. We're in the process right now of kicking off our next public transportation plan update for the state of Washington. So there's a lot of conversation going on, but it's, what do we do in the middays? How do we reconnect with microtransit? Because we were well on the way in the mobility on demand space, and then the pandemic hit. How do we support teleworking as a lifestyle choice that a lot of people are making? It's an interesting time to be in this space, and you'll have to look back 5 years from now and see how we did.
And Garrett, did you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I think we're in a similar situation where when it comes to transit, we're still trying to figure out what the future will look like. We are, on a rail side, we're extremely focused historically on getting people to and from New York City into Manhattan. Metro North goes right into Grand Central Station terminal, and that's been the lifeline for a lot of our lower southwestern portion of our state's economy. Also having people from New York come into Southwest Connecticut as well. So we know that a lot of those businesses are not having their employees come back into their office full time. We are hearing anecdotally, a lot of those will come back after Labor Day. I know the childcare industry has been hammered as well, with a lot of them not having as many spaces available. Summer camps didn't have as many spots available. So a lot of people, even though their offices may be opening, they don't have anywhere to send their children for the summer. So they're continuing to telework. So we're waiting to see what happens after Labor Day. We just announced we're going to bring back our service. Our service level right now is around 62% of pre-COVID service level on our rails. Beginning in August, we're going to bring it up to around 83% of pre-COVID service levels. But we're going to wait and see until Labor Day what it looks like after that. It did give us an opportunity to potentially reconfigure what that service looks like, not just the volume, but when those trains are departing and arriving. Because if the commutation pattern is changing, if people don't have to go in as early, as we've seen the commutation pattern on the roadways change, maybe it's changing on the rails as well. So that is some flexibility we're going to take advantage of and reevaluate our schedules. On the bus side, we saw the essential nature of bus transportation throughout the pandemic, especially at the peak lockdown in March and April here in Connecticut, as with the rest of the country. So as I mentioned earlier, we actually are increasing service levels beginning in August on our bus system in the city of New Haven. We're going to increase hours of service running until 1 a.m. We're going to be looking to increase services across the state in the next year or two, because we recognize the importance of serving areas that either are currently underserved by public transit, or the routes haven't really been optimized since they were established back in the 50s and 60s with previous employment patterns, shift work, employers, large factories that have long since left our state. So it's time for us to reevaluate where those public transit routes are running, and maybe serve other areas. So we're using this time to do that type of analysis statewide for our entire public transit fleet.
Yeah, I know a lot of the transit agencies that we're working with at APTA are in the same boat. They're kind of reassessing all of their routes, fixed and on demand and otherwise, and trying to determine what makes sense, what's critical for continuing to get people to where they live and work and otherwise. So I want to talk a little bit about technology, and I'll start by saying one of the interesting outcomes of some of the conversations that we've had with several of the chief innovation officers at transit agencies is that with COVID, or with the pandemic, our assumption that perhaps technology projects would fall by the wayside, especially in times when many agencies are really cramped in terms of their budgets, was wrong. In fact, many of the agencies that we're working with have prioritized some of the technology overhauls or technology projects that they had underway prior to COVID. And they seem to be full steam ahead with really embracing and picking up technology upgrades with their systems. So I want to first ask, were there any interesting technology projects that you did at your respective DOTs? Did you use things like predictive analytics to gauge or to monitor any of these massive changes in the transportation sector, or other technologies that might have kind of helped the state get through this?
I can start on that one. So we have begun to, we never stopped with some of their technology projects. As you mentioned, others haven't either. And we've actually viewed it as an opportunity to advance them and use it as a tool to bring people back to public transit. We recognize that the most important thing is to ensure they feel safe upon their return on public transportation. But then the next piece is show them the convenience of using public transportation and make sure they have a good experience. So we have proceeded with contactless fare systems, which we are a small state. We have under our DOT, we have a large rail system and a large bus system, but then there are smaller transit districts in our state as well, about a dozen of them. And so we're going to work to try and assist them with installation of contactless fare. We are going to look to see how can we get better connectivity for commuters in terms of wireless connection. Our rail system is along our coastline, very low lying, sea level, very poor cellular reception. So the biggest complaint we get from people commuting on our rail system is they always lose service. So we're looking at, okay, can we partner with telecom to get 5G installed along the right of way, or maybe have satellite Wi-Fi on our trains? So we're exploring that right now. But I think the most exciting part is the ability for us to show our legislators and the budget offices and the public the importance of collecting data and having data. It's always been a tough sell to say we need to invest in purchasing these data sets. And now we can point to the importance of collecting that data, purchasing those data sets, having the sensors out there to collect that data, and having the staff, data analytics capability in our staff. We've hired some new data analysts into our agency, which we did not have before. So we're using this experience to grow those capabilities in our agency, which we previously didn't have, that we always should have had. But just like Secretary Milar pointed out, we need to be able to use the data to make informed decisions. That's what our agency is pivoting to, and that will help us identify what technologies we want to pursue next.
Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
here in Washington State, the technology advances. We're a tech community, and we're putting a lot into it. We're busy. The two themes that we're measuring everything we do by anymore are response to climate change and social equity. The need for racial justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So technology is being applied with that in mind. On the decarbonization side, we have the second highest use of electric buses and the second highest use of electric vehicles of any state in the country. And we're pushing hard on that and applying that technology. It's the buses, but it's also the support facilities, and it's having the power infrastructure to get power to where it needs to be. We're electrifying the Washington State ferry fleet, which is a real exciting project. We have a couple of big boats that are at midlife, and we're going to pull 2 of the diesels out and replace them with batteries and run them like little Priuses, actually great big green and white Priuses going back and forth across the Puget Sound. They're going to operate in all electric mode with the diesel there as a backup for when the big earthquake hits, speaking of crises. But that requires a substantial amount of power at the dock, which is something we're working on. So we've been on the electric vehicle highway, vehicle highway, initiative that's been going on for over a quarter century here on the West Coast, and we continue to do that. We're using lane management technology to advance bus rapid transit in the central Puget Sound. The I-405-167 corridor is a 40-mile corridor where we have installed express toll lanes. And with that technology, with cameras and paint and some signs on comparable highways, I-5 north out of Seattle is 10 lanes of concrete. I-405 north out of Bellevue is 10 lanes of concrete. I-5 is 4 general purpose lanes and 1 high occupancy vehicle lane. 405 is 3 general purpose lanes and 2 express toll lanes, which is where the buses operate as well. During the peak hour, we're moving 35% more vehicles on I-405 as compared to I-5. And we're doing that with, again, cameras and signs, and the people who are using express toll lanes and paying a toll are funding it. But for our bus rapid transit system, when it's fully implemented, we're going to save an hour a day off of the trip from Linwood to Bellevue and back, which for public transportation users is a huge bonus. We're also looking at technology inside the agency. How do we take this telework transformation and make it real as we get into more of a hybrid work environment where some people are in the office and some people are at home? Our IT people really delivered during the pandemic. I had half of my agency at home. If you're operating one of our boats or doing guardrail work or plowing snow, you're not working in a home office, but about half the agency was. And the interesting thing about that is 75% of our employees who telework want to telework 3 days a week or more indefinitely going forward. And I think that's a trend throughout industry. The resistance is coming from managers primarily who are concerned about managing in this. And I'm telling our managers, get used to it, get over it, because if you don't facilitate what people want in terms of being productive employees and balancing their work and their life, they're going to go somewhere else. And so that telework transformation is a huge thing for us. The technology makes it possible. We had the tech before, we weren't using it, we were forced to use it, we found that we like it, and now we have to build on that. And another and the last investment I'll talk about is the need to invest in broadband, because that is our economy. Our highways, our transit systems, they are a physical spine to our infrastructure, but that virtual spine of data relies on the physical capacity for broadband. And we've talked a lot here in Washington about urban versus rural splits, and it's not really an urban versus rural split. It's a more of a well-to-do versus working and less well-to-do split, where we have parts of our very urban area where you can get a gigabyte or more service. It's great service. But in the same town, during the pandemic, transit agencies were serving as Wi-Fi hotspots for low-income neighborhoods who didn't have any other way to access the internet other than a transit agency bus sitting in a parking lot and families around it in their cars doing the things that they needed to do to get by in this economy. That really is unacceptable long-term, and that's a place where we need to make investment.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Both of you mentioned data, use of data collection in this kind of new environment where pretty much every technological implement we're using is in some way collecting data, in some cases of riders and users. What have you done to ensure that you are protecting and securing cyber operations? I know cyber vulnerability has been a hot topic, especially among public agencies in the last several years, who have seen kind of a number of cyber attacks. And so what are you doing, Garrett, I'll start with you, to secure your cyber operations?
Yeah, I think we may be lucky here in Connecticut because we are such a small state geographically and only 3.5 million people. Our state government has a lot of the cyber efforts centralized in our Department of Administrative Services. Our CIO has been in his position for over a decade now. And we have a cyber security action plan that our previous governor put into place. And I think we've seen the risks grow. Our centralized cyber team is always vigilant. But we, here at the DOT, I don't think it really hit home for us because, during an emergency or disaster, our teams know what they need to do. They have their radios, they have their phones, they go out, they clear the debris, they clear the snow, and then they come back to the garages and rest and go back out. But during the COVID, well, traditionally our state would have our emergency operations center activated and everyone would be in the one state armories facility in Hartford. We moved to a virtual EOC. Which was the first time we've ever done that. So everyone was connected digitally to the Emergency Operations Center dashboard. So if that were to go down, our state during some of the snow issues and our tropical storms that hit us last year, that disruption would have really hindered our ability to respond to those disasters. So it has heightened awareness here at our agency, which has traditionally, been a more concrete, asphalt, pavement, plowing type response. But we work closely with our state CIO to ensure that all of our networks are protected. Our data, it's all centralized stored now with one state storage as well. So by centralizing that, we're doing a lot more protection efforts that we as an agency alone wouldn't be able to achieve.
Roger?
Yeah, Nicole, if I told you the specifics, I'd have to kill you. So, in terms of the technology, we're trying to stay with the state of the practice as regards, cybersecurity. Our IT people have been very hard at work, but the place where we've really invested a lot of time and energy is educating our employees. You can have all the systems in the world, but if somebody screws up with a password or opens the wrong attachment on an email, what have you, you're toast. So, particularly with the teleworking, we have people at home on different systems. We've spent an awful lot of time educating and informing our people about how important behavior is and how important their role in all of that is. And we're also, knowing that nothing is foolproof. Fool resistant, but not foolproof. So you've got to have recovery plans, and that's a big part of what we do as well.
Great. Well, I have one final question for the both of you that is relevant to the future. You've both told me in depth all of the amazing things you've been focused on over the last 18 months, and I'm very impressed by both of you. But I want to know what your top 3 priorities are for your state DOT over the next, say, near term, 5 years, or far term, say 10 years. So I will start with Garrett and ask you, what are you focused on in the next 5 years and then 10 years out?
Yeah, so in the next 5 years, our goal here at the Connecticut DOT is to try to decarbonize our transportation system as much as possible. As with many other states, transportation is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions for the state of Connecticut. It's 38% of greenhouse gases. So we know that we have to pick up the pace and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and moving to 100% electric bus fleet, which is our goal in the next 12 years in the state. We can achieve that. Also focused on converting our state fleet, our state-owned fleet, over to electric as well. That's one of our priorities, is decarbonization. The second one is to address the huge backlog of state of good repair that we need to do. Instead of focusing on building new things or building new roads or expanding capacity, we need to focus on addressing that backlog of state of good repair, focusing on the rail infrastructure that we've had in place for 150 years. Some of our movable bridges are, one of them was built around the time of the Civil War. So we need to make sure that doesn't break down, and we need to replace that and use the next 5 to 10 years to do a complete refresh and rebuild of our infrastructure and address all those deficiencies. And lastly, we have about a third of our agency retiring next year. So we are going to be trying to focus on how to reinvent our agency for the next 125 years, because we just celebrated our 125th anniversary as an agency last year during COVID. So now we're going to focus on the next 125 with a third of our employees and their knowledge walking out the door. So that's going to be the next 1 year, is to focus on that silver tsunami we're facing.
Absolutely. Roger?
Yeah, we have 3 things that we're focused on. We are known, the Washington State DOT and DOTs in general, we're known as builders of stuff. We built the longest floating bridge in the world. We both built the largest diameter deep bore tunnel through downtown Seattle. We've built, huge highways across mountain passes and the like. We've built $200 billion worth of transportation stuff. What we're working hard on is educating ourselves and educating our partners and educating decision makers that while we're builders of stuff, what we've become is managers of assets and stewards of a system. So the solution to the problem is not always build more stuff. Sometimes we need to, but that needs to be the last thing we do after we address safety on the system, after we address state of good repair of the system. We're spending less than half of what we should be spending, which is a glide path to failure. We need to turn that around. And as secretary, there are 2 things I don't do. I don't appropriate funding for the agency, and I don't make the policy decisions. The legislature does that, and my job is to be a subject matter expert and inform them that, hey, we're spending less than half of what we should be spending, and that has long-term consequence. We need to use technology to manage our system more efficiently, and as Garrett said, to decarbonize this space, because that's, we are a problem. Let's solve that problem. We need to manage demand better than we do, because a highway full of electric cars is still a highway full of cars. And we need to address transportation as a means to an end and talk about that connection with land use. And then we need to add capacity. But we need to add capacity to our bicycle and pedestrian network. We have a $5 billion gap in completing that network. And at the other end of the scale, we need to add capacity on intercity rail, and particularly high-speed rail. So we call that whole bundle practical solutions at WashDOT. The second thing we need to work on, just like Connecticut, is workforce development. Our workforce is retiring, and we don't pay as well as Microsoft and Google and Amazon and Alaska Airlines, and my competitors for talent here in Washington State. So what do we do to be an employer of choice? It's a huge part of our mission. And the third piece of it is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. All of the DOTs through AASHTO signed on to a resolution acknowledging that our past behavior resulted in disparate impacts on low income and minority populations, and those impacts persist to this day. We have accepted that responsibility. We're committed to embracing the law in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and others, and using our good offices to make the country, in my case, Washington State, a place where justice, equity, diversity, inclusion are right at the front of mind, and that's how we make our decisions.
Great. Well, it looks like we're right about at the end of our portion of today's program. So I would like to thank Secretary Roger Milar and Deputy Commissioner Garrett Eucalito for joining me for this really important discussion today. APTA has been, working hard to help our members, the transit industry, weather this really intense storm. And I hope that we can continue to hear from really, important and poignant folks like you, hear about the great things you're doing to get your state DOTs through this storm as well. So again, my name is Nicole Dupuis. I'm with the American Public Transportation Association, and I will hand things back over to Hillary Serpis of Route 50.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our next session. My name is Hillary Serpis. I'm the Vice President and Group Publisher for State, Local, and Education at Route 50. I hope you've been enjoying the program today, and I'm really excited to have you joining us for the next session. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker, Jason Sutherland. Jason is the Head of Application and Data Modernization at CloudReach. Jason, I first want to thank you so much. Thank you and CloudReach for your support of today's program. We certainly appreciate you helping us to pull these conversations together.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So before we dive in to some of the questions I have for you, maybe, Jason, can you tell me a bit more about yourself, your background, and your role at CloudReach?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So other than obviously suffering from a overly long title, I've been at CloudReach for about 10 years and been a journey, certainly. CloudReach as a company, one that's very focused on helping organizations and public sector and the corporate world as well, really trying to modernize their IT portfolio, really trying to, unlock the promise of the cloud. And, we do that sort of, end from end. And so my journey through there has been really one that's been consultative. I've also worked on the product side as well, so really helping to build the products that drive these kind of transformations, and really help as well businesses and the like really establish ways of working around cloud services so that they can be successful as well. And like I said, it's been a 10-year journey to until now.
Great. So let's dive into some questions. We've been talking a lot today, and we've heard a lot from the speakers earlier in the session about transportation transformation specifically. So maybe can you talk a bit about what role will cloud capabilities have in this transition moving forward? And from your perspective, what trends are you seeing?
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. So I think it's probably important to, really frame this from two perspectives. There's really the functional perspective in terms of, what does the domain of transport really look like? There's also the technical or the cloud factors, what does this really mean from the technical side? So, firstly, just high level functionally, I think the domain, still trying to really solve that classic, how do I get from A to B problem? And how do you do that while really minimizing the impact on, users and infrastructure? I think that leads into the fact that transformation really means that it's about transforming really what is a critical infrastructure supplier and governance, I would say, to one which is really trying to provide sort of value-added services around that. And actually starting to see a lot of transport functions and businesses really start to emerge almost as a data business now, which is super important. I think that lends itself quite nicely into the sort of the technical fact is that again within this domain we're seeing a lot around data collection, around data analysis. There's huge really initiatives around this and into integration to data sharing, things like this as well. So what does that really mean? Well, it means that we're seeing a lot of the infrastructure that is now being connected using the Internet of Things, IoT, things like smart sensors, peripherals, everything from even just cameras. And this data collection is all about now taking data almost like going through transmutation, so really converting things like video feeds into usable data sets and trying to plug these into things like machine learning applications, and really trying to do this at scale as well. So before, again, very critical infrastructure but very disjointed. Now it's about, oh, actually everything is a source of data, let's now try to stitch that together and provide value. And I think that was really what cloud services was about. It's about doing that cost effectively without the upfront investment and trying to get the most from it. Uh, Simultaneously, and obviously goes hand in glove, there's really been one around this transformation around data analysis. So it's not just taking all this data, doing higher velocity reporting and business intelligence, but like I kind of touched on before, like things like machine learning. So these, creating these sophisticated models for reducing risk, creating profiles for predictive maintenance. The adoption of these cloud native technologies has really enabled, these vast data lakes and interfaces to people within and outside of the domain of transport to really create these, new avenues of value that we see there. And then, really, from the integration and data sharing perspective, we really see a lot more, I would say, interaction and integration with things like logistics, navigational use cases. And I think, I touched on, I've worked a lot in terms of ways of working. Well, cloud provides a really compelling way to really kind of come in, co-develop, co-innovate, and quickly go to market, with these new, smart products that are around, the transport space as well. I think just from a very perfunctory perspective, data sharing, this idea of, look, guys, we've got huge amounts of data. Let's go and find a way to now syndicate that data, share that data, and actually come out with better analysis as well. So I'll sort of finish the question slightly disjointedly with the, well, what does that mean today and tomorrow? I think, what are the practical applications of this? Well, obviously recent global events, things like offices opening up, COVID, the Department of Transport in cities and countries, and it doesn't matter what the scope is, there's all these new sort of avenues and ways people are traveling, but there's a what I would call like a frothiness to that as well. The patterns are very irregular, and there's so much change that it's really hard to become very predictable in terms of what the actual needs are. So having all this data, understanding the trends, the patterns, and being able to stitch it all together allows for a much better way, I would say, to maintain and improve on the impact of these different services. And on top of that as well, just simply integrating into things like gathering, what does weather data look like when we look at these patterns? How can we kind of predict how people are going to be using these services? Future view. Just lastly, things like, I think it's about paving the way for things like, autonomous vehicles and roads. And again, if I bring this back to the question around, cloud capabilities, what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing huge investment and, really setting up the foundations to kind of support, the next generation of transport and what that actually might mean.
That's great. So let's think about, I know, you've been with CloudReach for quite some time and worked with a lot of customers, right? So thinking about perhaps your own customers, can you share with us how they've deployed some of the technologies and efficiencies that you're talking about, and what impact has that had on their organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally speaking, though, it really comes around sort of the traffic management domain and creating these, really rich, data-centric platforms to manage traffic. And so, cloud tech's been adopted to really solve that problem of enhanced situational awareness. And it's been based on things like these traffic patterns. It's been helping to coordinate responses based on the real-time insights that we can get predict road device maintenance. With CloudReach has, been engaged to really integrate things like third-party tooling, so really unlocking the insights that are required. And we've used technologies like Looker or Power BI, and it's really helped to democratize, I would say, access to the data across a variety of teams. And it's also really reduced this dependence on what has really been typically aging on-premise data center infrastructure as well. And actually, I'll back up slightly and say, just to be clear, when we talk about things like democratized data, it's got a huge marketing kind of sort of tilt to it. But what we're really saying is that we've got these data services that being used to enable a well-governed but ultimately siloed-less way to consume and contribute to data, and that's been super important. What we're seeing with organizations we've worked with is breaking them from a very traditional way of working where they've suffered from a lot of bottlenecks in terms of how the business really gets access to and what they can do with particular data. So again, we've helped to democratize this. That has meant centralizing data services, but allowed for people to come to that watering hole and use it in the way that they want, which has been super important. And that's within an organization or outside of them as well. So bring it back to traffic management platform specifically, with a cloud-based design, it's been now possible to incorporate other cloud services and actually create a platform that has, and excuse the pun, like a proper roadmap as well. So before it was how could we do things operationally efficient, but now it's actually, well, what features do we actually want to almost provide with these types of platforms? And it could be things like public notifications or real-time signaling based on traffic events, being able to incorporate things like variable speed limits, and again, I already mentioned things like autonomous cars. From more of a technical perspective, what cloud technologies and what CloudReach have brought to the table was, really decoupling things like the cost of storing this immense wealth of data from the cost of trying to compute these insights that come from it. So beforehand, traditionally, these two things come together and are very much a singular cost. They're hard to decouple, becomes hard to track, but we've come in and we've helped to kind of optimize that and make sure that they're scalable and performant. We also just made the technology accessible and reusable. Cloud services, they help galvanize a lot of things that can be done, but actually there's a whole wealth of choice out there. So actually making making these technologies accessible and reusable within and outside of an organization could be easy to codify, easy to share. That has a huge value associated with it as well. And then just again, CloudReach has really helped sort of reduce, I think, the cost of these integrations as well within the cloud services sort of space. So again, with choice becomes almost too much choice. You really need to sort of focus in on the right areas that you want to kind of innovate or explore with. And often there's a huge cost to these kind of integrations. So coming in and making sure, hey guys, you can have this fabric of services that are going to really help. That's super important. But we come in, we can make sure that these are optimal. So yeah, I think again, I keep touching on the culture. It's definitely ways of working. It's changing the when we work with organizations, it's really changing that mindset to one that is, let's go do this in a product thinking sort of a way. And I think it's really, us plus cloud services has really changed the breadth of what ultimately has been, what's possible and integrated. And just to sort of end out, I guess, the answer to this question as well, just in terms of scale and shareability, we've worked with the Department of Transport in a way where they now have like a really robust statewide, crash database, and it's incredibly complete, with huge amounts of accurate geolocation data now, which is serves a huge bit of value to them. And many of the stakeholders, even just with that, they can now inform like all of their mitigation strategies, just as an example. So things from infrastructure planning decisions to asset and resource allocation, and even just automating the collection of data at source. Like that's a huge step beyond the capabilities that were there today.
So let's talk about this for a second. In your experience, right, I think that government leaders right now have so many competing priorities.
Right.
So I'd love to hear from you. What should transportation leaders be thinking about deploying this technology? And what challenges do you think are the most urgent?
Yeah, sure. That's great. So again, I'll break down, I think, this question to the technology perspective and then just the pragmatic kind of functional perspective as well, right? So from a technology standpoint, all the Department of Transports have massive amounts of data. This is typically residing in a lot of silos. The data is therefore underutilized, and there's this huge drive to leverage all these new cloud capabilities around machine learning and AI. And there's that question of how they're going to like democratize that, really harmonize that, not just statewide, but maybe at a federal level, even at a global level, right? How do you reconcile all of these data bits? So I think that question is, how do I make my data accessible? Hugely important here. I think the other question is, well, what economies of scale and value can be achieved when you actually combine data with other state departments as well? What level of enrichment can you bring to the equation, and what can collaboration, I should say, actually drive once we do that? So again, I mentioned things like whether there's others out there as well, where you can actually start to aggregate this together. I think when thinking of these, and when these are top of mind for transportation leaders, the biggest challenges are, well, yeah, data silos. You've got all these disconnected data sets. The challenges are with legacy systems. They're not inherently scalable. They're not built in a way to be innovative because they're very hard to iterate and improve upon. Um, Simultaneously, you have vendors who maybe aren't in a position to innovate as well. Maybe things are proprietary, not set up in a particular way where you can. And I think all of this really goes into the challenge of, well, it's really hard to get this, real-time data insight into what's actually happening across. Uh, there's other challenges like, well, data. How do I understand if data is, valuable or not, or even if it is current? So I would really urge transportation leaders to think these, how can we improve on these? How can I make, first and foremost, my data actually accessible? Because then from there, these other kind of challenges can be addressed. And so, therefore, I think from a functional perspective, getting the order of operation right when building out these data capabilities is super important. So, day one, unlock the data. I think day two, it's almost taking the cloud capabilities that are possible today along with this data and really focusing on almost creating what we would call a virtual representation of all the roads, the infrastructure, almost create what's called an industry like a digital twin, and really start to bring services and data kind of closer together. That's super important. From a day three perspective, you can then start to really tackle these use cases like enabling traffic shaping in response to, I said before, like highly into frothy environments that change with a hugely with a high velocity and with a regular predictability. So constantly changing scenarios. Take COVID, right, as an example of what drives that. Things like commutes. I think if you can do that, then day four, you're in a really good position. You've now built the foundations. You can now get your real-time insights. You now are streaming data and making decisions on the fly, and that's super important. And now you're in a really good position to really provide adaptivity and communicate actively between users and systems, right? So you now have infrastructure that I'd call quote unquote smart. You can now have an interaction with your users. You can now start to guide and influence behaviors. And then from there, well, the future is the limit, right? And so it's around that sort of how do you now influence these user behaviors, and how do you start to motivate around, fundamentally the core principles around things from private vehicle ownership and decoupling this need to own something to get somewhere, and actually integrating with interfaces that drive how people or what avenues people take to go and travel. How do you, again, thinking further ahead, measure and incentivize people taking green, sustainable routes, et cetera, et cetera. But these are all very high value use cases. It's really important to get the fundamentals right initially, and then build out into these different sort of social and environmental impact areas, which are highly valuable. So again, with sound like I'm rambling, cloud technologies that substantially increasing the access to the services which can add that kind of value. I would say that leaders need to think about the ways of working to really correctly harness them and implement effective things. And I would say really start with the fundamentals and get them right and build upon there.
I like that. I like how you've given step 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's great. We have about 1 more minute left. So before we close, do you have any final thoughts or insights regarding today's panel discussion and what we've just talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to wrap up in a minute. So key takeaways. 1, look, there's a huge data economy which cloud services can enable access to. top of mind, break the silos down, enable the sharing, reimagine yourself as a data business first. And then I think a lot of these questions get the answers that they deserve from there. I think two, get the fundamentals right, use the cloud services to build out iteratively, be use case driven. There's a lot of patterns we see in the global corporate and enterprise space. Success has always been seen when things are use case driven, where there's been product led thinking, and you can associate things back to value. So, having line of sight to how investment in cloud services can map to value, that's where you guarantee success. And, that's applicable in the public sector as well, right? Cloud services change how we work, they reduce the friction, and adopting IT capabilities we need to really functionally and non-functioning service these use cases, they still need to be used correctly. So it's well worth taking the time to lay out the right kind of calendar view in terms of how to kind of really harness them. And no, I mean that's it from me. I mean, I'd be amiss not to obviously have a shout out to CloudReach and Google. We're all about innovation, cloud engineering, data analytics, obviously machine learning. We want to talk to you. So if there is a problem or you want to just have a discussion and learn more, you can reach out to us at gcp@cloudreach.com, and happy to have that conversation. But thanks, Hillary. I think that's it from me.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you so much. And again, thanks to CloudReach and you, Jason, for your time today and for supporting our program. As we said, we've reached the end of our time, but this digital event has been recorded for those of you watching and will be available on demand on the event website. You'll also be receiving a recording via email. So we certainly encourage you to pass along to your colleagues and peers who might be interested in today's conversation. As always, we thank you for joining us. We hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and we will see you next time.